Welcome back to another outdoor writing done right. And today we're doing our outdoor because there's another article in the news relevant to writing, and this is an update over the Internet Archive Lending Library. Now, let me go ahead and summarize this, which we did a video on this actually about 2 months ago to the day. I think it was 2 months ago, like 2 days ago. What happened is at the beginning of this pandemic, when we started to see all these libraries close down, the Internet Archive jumps up and says, hey, Americans have, quote, already paid for these fees for these libraries that are sitting closed, and so we're going to do a public service, and we're going to eliminate wait lists. So what this meant is that even if a book doesn't exist in an ebook form, most technically, by the publisher, they would get a physical copy of the book, and the Internet Archive does not lend out the physical copies of the books like libraries do. But what they'll do is they'll take those physical books, scan them into an ebook format, and then they will give those out. Now, as long as they were behaving like other libraries, they fell under the jurisdiction of libraries, which meant a library could only give out one copy of a book if they had one copy. They could give out two if they had two, three if they had three, and then there were these established wait lists for in the event that the article was, or the book was already checked out. So what the Internet Archive did, though, way back in, this is in early April, is they said, hey, no more wait lists. Even if they only had one copy of a book, you could go onto the Internet Archive with an account and you could just download the books. There was no limit. There was no wait list. Someone could download a copy. Now, they expired after 2 weeks. So you'd get the copy, and then it would expire after 2 weeks. And they said, see, this is just fine. Their argument was just fine. The problem is, and my estimation that I did at the end of that summary video, is that they should have consulted with their lawyers, because right now they're potentially facing bankruptcy, because all the big name publishers came together, grouped together, and went after them. And that's exactly what I predicted was going to happen. So what's going on here? Let's talk about a couple of the odds and ends of libraries. First and foremost, libraries are kind of grandfathered into a system whereby a library can function in a way that as long as they have a license key, they can still lend the book. The way that the publishing industry has allowed and even in many ways endorsed this idea is that just like a movie rental store, I don't know if they exist anymore, but back in those days when we had movie rental stores, the movies that the rental store would get were special licensed copies to be rented. They actually cost over 10 times what the consumer price for the movie was. I had a friend that worked in the video industry, and he was showing me the list. It's like, you paid $150 for this movie? He says, yeah, but I'm going to rent it out like 50 times in the first 2 months I have it, and it's going to cover the rent. Now, of course, they're only renting out for $2, $3, but over the course of the life of the movie, it made sense. The movie industry was just fine with that. It was basically like making 10 sales right up front on release day, which was very good. The video stores could upfront that cost. Over the life of the movie, they would start to see profit after it. After the first couple of months, every rental on that movie was profit. And that's how the industry worked. Well, publishers started doing the same thing with libraries. So when you go into your library and you grab a copy of an audiobook, for example, the audiobooks, the libraries end up paying about twice or 2 to 3 times amount what the audiobook costs as a regular consumer does, because they'll get the copy and then they'll be able to continuously lend it out. That's okay as long as, even though it's a digital file, you bought one license, you can lend out one. So if it's a popular book, the library might go out and buy 3 licenses and be able to lend out 3 copies of the book. As long as that's the way the system was working, publishing companies just fine with it. They don't have a problem. They don't have a problem with libraries. They don't have a problem with the Internet Archive. The problem came up is when the Internet Archive came up and said, no wait lists. If we've managed to get our hands on a physical book, anybody can check it out as much as they want. Now, this was set to expire by the end of June. Nevertheless, there was a 3-month period of time when book sales dropped. And by the way, you could still buy ebooks on Amazon. You could still rent ebooks from your library. This was nothing more than hey, we're just going to go ahead and do this because we're nice and we want maybe an element of we want to stick it to the big guys. And then you'll see the people in the comment sections going, oh yeah, well, who wants all these publishers having this anyway and stealing authors' rights? No, a publishing company doesn't generally own the copyright to the book. The author does, just an FYI. If you're in a publishing company that has taken your copyright, unless it was a work from hire, you negotiated a bad deal. Most publishing companies, you keep the copyright for your work. So why the big middleman? That's another argument that I've seen in the comments. Well, very simple. Because there's a lot that goes into making a book successful, from the typesetting, to the ebook production, to the audiobook production, to the cover design, to the marketing, to the distribution ends. All of these cost money. And while there's a lot of resources for indie publishing, and my channel exists to teach you how to do this stuff without a big publishing company, but there is a value added in the publishing companies to do that. That's why. And one of the things that the publishing companies do is they can come together and protect their interests of not only themselves, but also the interests of their authors. And that's exactly what they did. From Ars Technica, we have an article here. The lawsuit over online book lending could bankrupt the Internet Archive. And as I said in my other videos, I think that would be a sad thing. The Internet Archive gives us a lot of valid things, including their ebook lending library. I'm okay with their system as long as they're operating in accordance the way libraries operate. And so they go through here. The 4 of the nation's leading book publishers have sued the Internet Archive online library, best known for maintaining the Internet Wayback Machine. That will be the most tragic loss. This company goes down, the loss of the Wayback Machine is a significant loss. I'm saddened by this. I would like it if I'll get to my conclusions at the end. The Internet Archive makes scanned copies of books, both public domain and under copyright, available on the public site called the Open Library. Quote, despite the Open Library moniker, IA's action, that's Internet Archive's actions, grossly exceed legitimate library services, do violence to the Copyright Act, and constitute willful digital privacy on an industrial scale, wrote the publishers Hachette, HarperCollins, Wiley, and Penguin Random House in their complaint. Lawsuit was filed in New York federal court on Monday. For almost a decade, the Open Library has offered users the ability to borrow scans of in-copyright books via the internet. Until recently, the service was based on a concept called controlled digital lending that mimics constraints of conventional libraries. Okay, that's the point where if they maintain doing that, no problem at all. The library would only lend as many digital copies as it had physical copies in the warehouse. If all copies of a book were checked out by other patrons, you'd have to join a waiting list. Again, no problem lending a book under that constraint. In March, as the coronavirus panic was gaining steam, the Internet Archive announced it was dispensing with the waiting list system under a program called the National Emergency Library. The Internet Archive began allowing an unlimited number of people to check out the same book at the same time, even if they only owned a single physical copy. Before this change, the publishers largely looked the other way as IE and few other libraries experimented with digital lending concepts. Some publishing groups condemned the practice, but no one filed a lawsuit over it. Perhaps the publishers feared setting an adverse precedent if court ruled that the CDL was legal. But the IA's emergency lending program was harder for publishers to ignore. So this week, as a number of states have been lifting quarantine restrictions, the publishers sued the Internet Archive. In an email, IA founder Brewster Kahle described the lawsuit as, quote, disappointing. He says, quote, as a library, Internet Archive acquires books and lends them as libraries have always done, he wrote. Publishers suing libraries for lending books, in this case, protected digital versions, and while schools and libraries are closed, is not in anyone's interest. That's his opinion. And frankly, as an author, I think he should take his opinion and shove it where the sun don't shine, because it's not valid. Because what the Internet Archive is doing is an absolute blatant violation of copyright law, because he's lending out digital copies, which you can still get at your local library. You can still purchase those on Amazon. You can still purchase those directly from the authors. And all they're doing here is reducing the number of author sales, or even just doing more damage to the system in using the coronavirus as an excuse to do that. Publishers have a pretty strong case. That's quoted probably from a legal expert. Publishers' legal argument is straightforward. The Internet Archive is making and distributing copies of the books without written permission from copyright holders. That's generally illegal unless a defendant can show it is authorized by one of copyright law's various exceptions. Legal experts tell Arts that Internet Archive's best response is to argue that its program is fair use. So fair use is, let me explain fair use. Fair use is when you're doing something under a few exceptions. One of these is an educational. You're going into a classroom, you're opening up the book, you're scanning a few copies from a book to hand as printouts as part of an educational course. That's fair use. As part of a research project, that's fair use. As part of a critique, that's fair use. But what they're doing is taking books, distributing them in whole with unlimited cases to anybody with an Internet Archive account. That is a blatant violation of fair use. Under no circumstance would any court look to that and say this is fair use. That's their best shot, though. That's a flexible legal doctrine that's been used to justify a wide range of copying over decades, from recording television broadcasts for personal use to quoting a few sentences of book in a review. See, those are examples of fair use. Most relevant to our purposes, the courts have held it is fair use to scan books for limited purpose, such as building a book search engine. While considering fair use claim, courts consider several factors, including the impact on the use of the market of the original work. A book search engine, for example, is not a substitute for reading books, but rather helps readers find new books they might want to buy. The best example of this is Google's search thing, which they have a way that you can search for an individual couple contents or sentences, but you can't actually view the whole book utilizing Google's services. It's harder to come up with compelling arguments that the Internet Archive's open-ended lending program is fair use. James Grummelman, a copyright scholar at Cornell University, tells Ars that he is withholding the judgment until he sees the Internet Archive's response. However, he said, it seems like the publishers have a pretty strong case. I think there are arguments for fair use, but they're not terribly strong arguments, he said in a phone interview. Now, there's this question over this, but this is a pandemic. We have to have this exception for the pandemic. The Internet Archive would have a stronger argument if it continued to limit the number of copies that would be lent out in a scenario, i.e. could argue the program's impact on the market was a little different from a conventional. In other words, hey, we're going to limit it to 10 instead of unlimited. They would have a stronger argument. And I'll take a parenthetical here and say some people in the comments of these articles have said, yeah, but can you prove that they've actually lent it out? Well, the problem is that part of the copyright law, you don't have to prove it. You just have to have intent to harm, because every violation of intent to harm is up to a maximum penalty of $150,000. That's a devastating thing on the basis of doing this for every copyrighted book. My apologies for the weirdness of the sun at this point. I could slide this way, or I'll just go with it because we're almost done. Instead, the Internet Archive will likely need to make a novel argument that unique circumstances of a pandemic justifies allowing types of infringement that would be clearly illegal at other times. Grummelman wasn't able to identify any other cases where courts have made that kind of leap. I also spoke with John Bergamer, a copyright expert at the copyright reform group Public Knowledge. He said there's a pretty strong fair use argument for both the Internet Archive's previous controlled lending libraries and its new approach without waiting lists. Bergaman pointed out to the fact that millions of books are currently locked up at libraries that have been closed due to the pandemic. That said, he creates a unique situation that could justify digital lending activities that would otherwise be illegal. But Bergamer couldn't name any specific decisions which back up IA's aggressive interpretation of the law. Now, I'm not going to read the last part of the article. I'll link that. You can read that for yourself. It's basically about what's at stake. The problem is the Internet Archive staked everything on this one fairly foolish idea. There's no reason. If they simply consulted the lowest level flunky copyright law at the lowest no-name university ever, he'd tell them, I wouldn't do that. Because they're walking on shaky ground on this point. And so what do I think would be the best outcome? The best outcome is Internet Archive pulls the plug on the program effective immediately and offers some small settlement and promises to never do that again. Because if they don't do that, we will feasibly lose the Internet Archive, and that would be a tragic loss. Even the old method of, hey, single distribution, I'm okay with that. They should have reached out to the publishers. They should have tried to work out a deal. I haven't seen evidence if they did that or not, but maybe it exists. I don't know. But ultimately, the Internet Archive, a small nonprofit organization that in many arguments could say just wants to stick it to the big big corporations, and a lot of people who support the Internet Archive are just interested in sticking it to the big corporations. The problem is those big corporations are the ones that do pay the majority of authors, the majority of their royalties for the majority of their books, and they are protecting the interests of not just themselves, but also the interests of the millions of authors that they work with. So the best scenario here is that the Internet Archive pulls the plug on the program immediately, offers a lump sum settlement, and it goes away. Because I believe that if they do something like that, the publishers will indeed back down. That's my opinion. Those are my thoughts on the situation. I think it was really foolish for the Internet Archive to do, and it'd be really sad if we lose the Internet Archive because it provides a very good service otherwise. Those are my thoughts. Let me know all your thoughts in the comments down below. Also, by the way, I'll mention here the book Synaptergy is now out. This is my science fiction novel. I'll have a link to that in the description down there as well. Just head on over to the Synaptergy website. I'm updating that on a regular basis with all the different purchase links that exist that I found out there on the internet. Check around your local favorite or your favorite online bookstore or your favorite place where they can order a copy for you. You can probably find a copy of the book there. So thanks for coming along, and I hope that we have taught you how to get your writing done right.